The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Air Station as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her flight suit one final time. She had been flying FA-18 Super Hornets for 3 years now, but today felt different. Today she would be attending a joint military briefing that would bring together various branches of the armed forces for a classified mission discussion. Sarah walked through the corridors of the base, her boots echoing against the polished floors. Other pilots nodded respectfully as she passed, recognizing her as one of the squadron's most skilled aviators. At 28, she had already earned a reputation for precision flying and quick thinking under pressure. Her record was spotless, her dedication unwavering, and her passion for aviation burned as bright as the afterburners of her aircraft. The briefing room was larger than usual, filled with personnel from different military branches. Sarah noticed the mix of uniforms immediately: Army Rangers in their distinctive berets, Air Force pilots in their blue uniforms, Marines with their characteristic bearing, and Navy personnel like herself. But what caught her attention most were the men seated at the front of the room, wearing the unmistakable trident pin of the Navy SEALs. Captain Jake Thompson commanded attention without saying a word. His presence filled the room with an intensity that made everyone sit up straighter. At 35, he had spent over a decade in special operations, leading missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations. His weathered face told stories of countless operations, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the assembled personnel. The briefing began with standard protocol discussions, but Sarah sensed an undercurrent of excitement in the room. This wasn't just another routine meeting. The mission parameters being discussed involved complex coordination between ground forces and air support, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. Sarah found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the tactical discussions. Captain Thompson stepped forward to address the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. He spoke about the importance of seamless integration between different military branches, emphasizing how modern warfare demanded unprecedented levels of cooperation and trust between units that had traditionally operated independently. Success in our upcoming operations will depend entirely on our ability to work as one unified force, Thompson explained, his gaze moving across the room. Ground teams need to trust air support completely, and pilots need to understand the realities of ground combat. As the discussion continued, Thompson began asking specific questions about aircraft capabilities, response times, and the precision of modern targeting systems. Sarah noticed that his questions weren't the typical surface-level inquiries that ground forces usually made about air support. These were detailed technical questions that demonstrated a deep understanding of aviation operations. When Thompson asked about the psychological pressures faced by pilots during close air support missions, Sarah was surprised by the sophistication of his inquiry. Most ground personnel assumed that flying high above the battlefield insulated pilots from the emotional weight of combat. But Thompson's question revealed an understanding that air combat carried its own unique psychological challenges. The room fell silent when Thompson posed his next question directly to the assembled pilots. "I want to understand something," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "When you're providing close air support and you see ground forces in immediate danger, what goes through your mind in those critical seconds before you engage?" Several experienced pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was an intensely personal question that touched on the deepest aspects of combat flying, the responsibility of protecting ground forces, while avoiding friendly fire incidents created a psychological pressure that few people outside of aviation could truly comprehend. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that Thompson wasn't asking this question out of casual curiosity. His inquiry suggested a level of respect for the pilot's role that was rarely acknowledged by ground forces. Most special operations personnel focused primarily on their own mission parameters, but Thompson seemed genuinely interested in understanding the complete picture of joint operations. The silence stretched for several seconds before Thompson's gaze fell directly on Sarah. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, reading her name tag. "You've been quiet during this discussion. What's your perspective on the psychological aspects of close air support?" Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She had participated in numerous briefings before, but something about Thompson's direct question felt different. This wasn't a test of her technical knowledge or her ability to recite standard procedures. He was asking for her honest assessment of one of the most challenging aspects of combat flying. Standing slowly, Sarah took a moment to collect her thoughts. She realized that her response could influence how the entire room perceived not just her capabilities, but the capabilities of all the pilots present. The weight of representation settled on her shoulders as she prepared to answer a question that would reveal more about her character than any flight evaluation ever could. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah prepared to speak. She could feel the attention of dozens of highly trained military personnel focused entirely on her response. Captain Thompson's question had created a moment that would define not just her own standing in this group, but potentially the relationship between the air and ground forces for the entire operation. Sarah looked directly at Thompson, noting the genuine interest in his expression. This wasn't a man trying to intimidate or test her resolve. This was a professional seeking to understand a critical aspect of joint military operations. Her respect for his approach began to grow, as she realized that his question came from a place of strategic thinking rather than simple curiosity. The moment stretched as Sarah formulated her response. Knowing that her words would be weighed carefully by everyone present, she understood that Thompson's question represented an opportunity to bridge the gap between air and ground forces, to help each side understand the challenges and pressures faced by the other. This was her chance to contribute to the success of future operations by fostering genuine understanding and cooperation. As she prepared to speak, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She had trained for years to handle pressure situations, and this was simply another test of her ability to perform under scrutiny. The difference was that this time, her performance would be measured not by her flying skills, but by her ability to articulate the complex realities of combat aviation to people whose lives might depend on her accuracy and honesty. Sarah took a deep breath and met Captain Thompson's steady gaze. The room remained completely silent, waiting for her response to his question about the psychological pressures of close air support missions. She knew that her answer would set the tone for how ground forces perceived pilots, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. "Captain Thompson," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident, "when I'm flying close air support and I see ground forces in immediate danger, the first thing that goes through my mind isn't fear or hesitation, it's mathematics." She paused, noting the slight surprise that flickered across several faces in the room. "I'm calculating distances, wind speed, the trajectory of my ordnance, and the exact positioning of friendly forces." Thompson leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued by her unexpected response. Sarah continued, "But behind those calculations is something much more personal. Every person on the ground has a name, a family, a story. When I'm providing close air support, I'm not just dropping ordnance on targets. I'm protecting someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. The weight of that responsibility is something I carry into every mission." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the ground forces personnel in the room. Sarah had touched on something that many of them had never considered, that pilots viewed their role not as distant observers, but as active protectors of individual lives. "The psychological pressure comes from the precision required," Sarah explained further. "Ground forces trust us to deliver ordnance within meters of their position. They're counting on our ability to distinguish between friend and foe in split-second decisions. That level of trust creates a pressure that's different from anything else in aviation." Captain Thompson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant Martinez, you mentioned trust. In your experience, how do we build that trust between air and ground units? What would help ground forces better understand how to work with pilots?" Sarah appreciated the depth of his question. It wasn't just about technical procedures. It was about human relationships and communication. "Communication is everything," she replied. "When ground controllers paint targets and call for air support, the more information they can provide about the tactical situation, the better we can serve them. We need to understand not just where the enemy is, but where friendly forces will be moving, what their escape routes are, and what their backup plans might be." She gestured toward the tactical display at the front of the room. "From 30,000 feet, everything looks different. What appears to be a simple target engagement from our perspective might be incredibly complex on the ground. When ground forces help us understand the complete picture, we can provide much more effective support." Thompson's questions continued, and Sarah found herself engaged in a conversation that went far beyond typical briefing protocols. He asked about communication delays, about how weather affected precision, about the decision-making process when multiple targets presented themselves simultaneously. Each question demonstrated his genuine desire to understand the realities of air combat. "Lieutenant," Thompson said, "I have to admit something. Most of the ground forces I work with assume that pilots have an easy job compared to infantry. You're up there, relatively safe, while we're down here taking direct fire. Your perspective is changing my understanding of that assumption." Sarah smiled for the first time during the briefing. "Captain, with respect, I think all military personnel face unique challenges. Your job requires physical courage and split-second tactical decisions under direct threat. My job requires technical precision and the ability to make life-and-death decisions about people I can't see clearly from my altitude. Either job is easy, but they're different kinds of difficult." The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Williams, the senior officer overseeing the briefing. "This discussion is exactly what we need for the upcoming operation," he announced. "The mission we're planning will require unprecedented coordination between Special Operations Forces and close air support. Lieutenant Martinez, Captain Thompson, I want you two to work together on developing the communication protocols for this operation." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. Working directly with a SEAL captain on developing operational protocols was an honor, but it also meant that her performance would be under intense scrutiny. She glanced at Thompson and was surprised to see what appeared to be approval in his expression. After the briefing concluded, Thompson approached Sarah directly. "Lieutenant, I'd like to continue our conversation. Would you be available to discuss some specific scenarios this afternoon?" "Of course, Captain," Sarah replied. "I'm scheduled for flight training until 1500 hours, but I'm free after that." Thompson nodded. "Perfect. Meet me at the Tactical Simulation Center at 15:30. I want to run through some scenarios that will help me understand how pilots process information during complex missions." As the room emptied, Sarah found herself both nervous and excited about the afternoon session. Working with Special Operations Forces was something every pilot aspired to, but the reality was often more challenging than the aspiration. Thompson's approach suggested that this would be different from typical joint training exercises. Sarah spent her flight training session thinking about the questions Thompson had asked. His inquiries had forced her to articulate aspects of flying that she had never really examined consciously. The psychological pressure of close air support wasn't something pilots typically discussed in detail, but Thompson's questions had made her realize how much mental preparation went into every mission. During her post-flight debriefing, Sarah's squadron commander noticed her distracted demeanor. "Martinez, everything okay? You seemed focused but distant during the training flights." "Just thinking about the joint operation briefing this morning, sir," Sarah replied. Captain Thompson from the SEALs asked some really insightful questions about our role in close air support. Her commander raised an eyebrow. "Thompson? I've heard good things about him. Word is he's one of the most innovative tactical thinkers in special operations. If he's taking a personal interest in understanding air support, that's a good sign for the mission." Sarah nodded, feeling her confidence grow. If Thompson had a reputation for innovation and tactical thinking, then her afternoon session with him might be more valuable than she had initially realized. She began to see this as an opportunity not just to contribute to the upcoming mission, but to help bridge the gap between air and ground forces in a way that could benefit future operations. As she prepared for the afternoon session, Sarah reviewed her knowledge of SEAL operational procedures. She wanted to be able to discuss air support from their perspective as well as her own. The more she could understand about ground operations, the better she could serve as a liaison between the two worlds of military aviation and special operations. The Tactical Simulation Center buzzed with electronic displays and sophisticated computer systems when Sarah arrived at exactly 15:30 hours. Captain Thompson was already there, studying a large tactical map spread across a conference table. The room smelled of coffee and the distinctive ozone scent of electronic equipment running at full capacity. "Lieutenant Martinez, punctual as expected," Thompson said without looking up from the map. "I've been reviewing the mission parameters for our upcoming operation. The terrain presents some unique challenges for both air and ground coordination." Sarah approached the table and immediately recognized the topographical features displayed on the map. The mission area featured mountainous terrain with narrow valleys, limited landing zones, and unpredictable weather patterns. It was exactly the kind of environment that made close air support both critical and extremely challenging. This terrain will definitely complicate things, Sarah observed, tracing potential flight paths with her finger. The mountains will limit our approach angles, and the narrow valleys mean we'll have very little room for error in target identification. Thompson looked up, his expression serious. That's exactly why I wanted to run through these scenarios with you. My team will be operating in an environment where traditional air support protocols might not be sufficient. We need to develop new communication methods and contingency plans. He activated the simulation system, and the room's displays came alive with a three-dimensional representation of the mission area. Sarah was impressed by the level of detail in the simulation. It included real-time weather data, accurate terrain modeling, and dynamic threat assessment capabilities. Let's start with a basic scenario, Thompson said, manipulating the controls to position virtual ground forces in the simulation. My team is moving through this valley toward an objective when we encounter unexpected resistance. We need immediate close air support, but our position makes traditional approaches impossible. Sarah studied the scenario carefully. The simulated SEAL team was positioned in a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides. Enemy forces occupied elevated positions that provided them with clear fields of fire, while offering minimal exposure to traditional air attack vectors. From a pilot's perspective, Sarah explained, this scenario requires us to think creatively about engagement angles. Traditional high-altitude bombing runs won't work because the valley walls will block our line of sight to the targets. We'd need to come in low, following the valley floor, which exposes us to ground fire but gives us the angle we need. Thompson nodded, his attention completely focused on her analysis. What kind of communication would you need from the ground team to execute that approach safely? Sarah considered the question carefully. We'd need real-time updates on enemy positions, especially any anti-aircraft threats. Your team would need to provide continuous guidance on friendly force positions because our approach angle will make visual identification extremely difficult, and we'd need clear escape routes planned in advance because a low-valley approach limits our maneuvering options. Show me, Thompson said, handing her the simulation controls. Sarah programmed a flight path into the system, demonstrating how an aircraft would need to approach the target area. The simulation showed her proposed route following the valley floor at extremely low altitude, requiring precise timing and coordination with ground forces. The key is synchronized movement, Sarah explained as the simulation played out. Your ground team would need to mark their exact position and then move to predetermined safe zones before we begin our approach. The timing has to be perfect because we'll only have seconds to identify targets and engage before we have to climb out of the valley. Thompson watched the simulation intently, asking detailed questions about timing, communication protocols, and backup plans. His questions revealed a deep understanding of tactical operations that impressed Sarah. Most ground officers had a limited understanding of aviation constraints, but Thompson seemed to grasp both the capabilities and limitations of close air support. Let's try a more complex scenario, Thompson said, resetting the simulation. Same terrain, but now we have civilians in the area and multiple enemy positions. How does that change your approach? The new scenario was significantly more challenging. The simulation showed a village in the valley with confirmed civilian presence, while enemy forces had positioned themselves among the buildings. Traditional rules of engagement made airstrikes extremely risky, but the ground team still needed support. Sarah stared at the display, feeling the weight of the simulated decision. This is where air support becomes as much about what we don't do as what we do, she said finally. With civilians present, we might need to switch from offensive air support to reconnaissance and communication relay. Explain that, Thompson requested. Instead of delivering ordnance, we could use our altitude advantage and sensor systems to provide your team with real-time intelligence about enemy movements. We could identify escape routes, count enemy personnel, and track their positions while your team maneuvers on the ground. Sometimes the best air support is information rather than firepower. Thompson's expression showed genuine surprise. That's not how most pilots think about close air support. Most pilots aren't asked to think beyond the traditional role, Sarah replied. But modern warfare requires flexibility. Our aircraft are equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment. In scenarios like this, that might be more valuable than our weapon systems. The afternoon session continued with increasingly complex scenarios. Thompson presented situations involving multiple ground teams, changing weather conditions, equipment failures, and evolving threat environments. Each scenario required Sarah to think creatively about how air assets could support ground operations beyond traditional combat roles. What impressed Sarah most was Thompson's willingness to adapt his own tactical thinking based on her input. When she explained how certain ground movements would improve air support effectiveness, he modified his approaches accordingly. Their collaboration was becoming a genuine exchange of expertise rather than a one-sided briefing. "Lieutenant," Thompson said as they concluded the final scenario, "this session has changed my understanding of air-ground coordination significantly. Your insights about using aircraft for reconnaissance and communication relay open up tactical options I hadn't considered." Sarah felt a surge of professional pride. "Captain, your questions have forced me to think about air support in ways I never have before. Most ground officers focus only on the firepower aspect, but you're looking at the complete picture of how air assets can contribute to mission success." Thompson saved the simulation data and turned to face her directly. "I want to propose something. For the upcoming operation, I'd like you to be our primary air liaison, not just for this mission but for developing new joint operation protocols that could be used throughout the military." The proposal was unexpected and significant. Serving as an air liaison for special operations would mean additional training, increased responsibility, and visibility throughout the military hierarchy. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could define a pilot's career. "I'm honored by the suggestion, Captain," Sarah replied. "What would that involve specifically?" Thompson outlined his vision for enhanced air-ground coordination, describing training programs that would give pilots better understanding of ground operations, while teaching ground forces more about aviation capabilities. It was an ambitious plan that could revolutionize how different military branches work together. As their session concluded, Sarah realized that her morning response to Thompson's question had led to something much larger than she had anticipated. What had started as a simple briefing was evolving into a partnership that could influence military operations for years to come. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself in an environment completely foreign to her aviation background. The SEAL training facility at Coronado felt like stepping into another world entirely. The morning sun reflected off the ocean as she watched Thompson's team run through combat drills on the beach, their movements precise and coordinated despite the challenging sandy terrain. "This is where it all starts to make sense," Thompson said, joining her at the observation point. "Understanding how my team moves and thinks will help you provide better air support. But more importantly, it'll help you communicate with other ground forces more effectively." Sarah had requested this additional training after their simulation session. She realized that truly effective air-ground coordination required her to understand ground operations from the inside out. Thompson had arranged for her to spend a week with his team, learning their procedures and experiencing their perspective firsthand. The training began with basic tactical movement. Sarah learned how ground teams communicated through hand signals, how they coordinated movement through difficult terrain, and how they maintained situational awareness while under pressure. The physical demands were unlike anything she had experienced in aviation training. "Everything we do is about minimizing our signature," explained Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Thompson's second-in-command as they practiced low-profile movement techniques. "We assume that someone is always watching, always listening. Every movement has to be deliberate and calculated." Sarah began to understand how this mindset affected requests for air support. When ground teams called for assistance, they weren't just asking for firepower. They were revealing their position and potentially compromising their mission security. The decision to request air support involved complex tactical calculations that she had never fully appreciated. During a training exercise that simulated calling for close air support, Sarah experienced the ground perspective for the first time. Lying in a simulated forward position while aircraft flew overhead, she felt the vulnerability that ground forces experienced when relying on air assets for protection. "It's completely different down here," she told Thompson during a break in training. "From the cockpit, I see tactical displays and target coordinates. Down here, I see individual people making life and death decisions with incomplete information." Thompson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd understand. When my team calls for air support, we're not just providing coordinates. We're trusting someone we can't see to make perfect decisions about our lives." The training intensified as the week progressed. Sarah learned to use ground communication equipment, practiced calling in simulated airstrikes from the perspective of a ground controller, and experienced the stress of coordinating multiple elements while under simulated enemy fire. One particular exercise involved a night operation where Sarah served as a ground controller, directing actual aircraft through a complex close air support scenario. The experience was transformative. Instead of being the pilot receiving instructions, she was the person providing them, responsible for guiding aircraft to targets while ensuring the safety of ground personnel. Fox 2-1. "This is ground control," Sarah spoke into the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Enemy position is 200 meters north of my location, marked by infrared strobe. Friendlies are moving east to your reference point, Charlie." Hearing the pilot's response from the ground perspective gave Sarah new appreciation for the trust involved in air-ground coordination. The pilot was following her directions without being able to see the complete tactical situation. Just as she had done countless times from the cockpit, Thompson observed the exercise from a nearby position, noting how Sarah's aviation background allowed her to provide more detailed and accurate guidance than typical ground controllers. Her understanding of aircraft capabilities and limitations made her directions more precise and actionable. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant," Thompson said after the exercise concluded. "You're thinking like both a pilot and a ground controller simultaneously. That dual perspective is exactly what we need for the upcoming operation." The week of ground training culminated in a joint exercise where Sarah flew her FA-18 while coordinating directly with Thompson's team on the ground. The exercise simulated the exact terrain and conditions they would face in their upcoming mission, allowing them to test their new communication protocols under realistic conditions. From the cockpit, Sarah could see Thompson's team moving through the valley below, their positions marked by infrared signatures visible through her aircraft's targeting systems. The training had given her new appreciation for how small and vulnerable ground teams appeared from altitude, even through sophisticated sensor equipment. "Ground control. This is Skyknight 1, Sarah transmitted. "I have visual on your position and confirm no enemy movement in your immediate area. Request permission to begin reconnaissance sweep of Objective Alpha." Thompson's voice came through her headset clearly, despite the complex radio relay systems required for secure communication. "Skyknight 1, permission granted. Be advised, civilian traffic reported in Grid Square 77. Proceed with caution." The exercise continued for 2 hours, with Sarah providing both reconnaissance information and simulated close air support for multiple tactical scenarios. The integration between air and ground elements was smoother than either had experienced in previous joint operations. After landing, Sarah joined Thompson's team for the post-exercise debrief. The session revealed how much both sides had learned from the integrated training approach. Ground personnel had gained better understanding of how to provide information that pilots could use effectively, while Sarah had developed intuitive understanding of ground tactical needs. "This changes everything," said Chief Petty Officer Johnson, one of Thompson's most experienced operators. "Having an air liaison who understands ground operations means we can communicate much more effectively during actual missions." Thompson agreed, but his focus was already shifting toward the broader implications of their training success. "This model needs to be expanded throughout the military. Every air squadron should have pilots with ground experience, and every ground unit should have personnel who understand aviation operations." Sarah found herself excited about the possibilities. The simulation training was valuable, but this hands-on experience is what really makes the difference. Understanding the physical and psychological pressures of ground operations changes how I think about every aspect of air support. As the week concluded, Sarah realized that her role was evolving beyond anything she had originally envisioned. She was no longer just a pilot who happened to be working with Special Operations Forces. She was becoming a bridge between two military communities that had traditionally operated with limited understanding of each other's capabilities and constraints. Thompson pulled her aside as the training week ended. "Lieutenant, I want to discuss the next phase of our collaboration. The upcoming mission is just the beginning. I believe what we're developing here could revolutionize joint military operations, but we need to prove it works under actual combat conditions." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The training had been intensive and eye-opening, but real combat would test whether their new approaches could save lives and improve mission effectiveness when everything was on the line. I'm ready for whatever comes next, Captain, Sarah replied. This week has shown me that effective air-ground coordination is about much more than technical procedures. It's about building relationships and understanding between people who depend on each other in life and death situations. The foundation for their upcoming mission was now in place, built on mutual respect and comprehensive understanding of each other's operational requirements. Both Sarah and Thompson knew that their real test was still ahead of them. The mission briefing room felt different this time. 6 weeks of intensive preparation had transformed the space from a place of theoretical discussion into a command center focused on real-world execution. Sarah stood beside Thompson at the front of the room, their partnership now official and recognized throughout the command structure. Colonel Williams addressed the assembled personnel with gravity that reflected the mission's importance. Operation Mountain Echo represents a new approach to joint military operations. The success of this mission will determine whether our integrated air-ground coordination protocols become standard throughout the military. The target was a terrorist compound nestled deep in mountainous terrain, accessible only through narrow valley approaches that made traditional air support extremely challenging. Intelligence indicated that the compound housed both enemy combatants and civilian hostages, creating a scenario that demanded perfect coordination between all military elements. Sarah reviewed the mission parameters one final time, noting how their weeks of preparation had addressed each potential challenge. The flight plan incorporated multiple contingencies, alternative approach routes, and detailed protocols for handling unexpected developments. Thompson's ground team had rehearsed their movements until they could execute them flawlessly, even under extreme stress. The weather window is optimal, reported the meteorological officer. Clear skies with minimal wind, but that could change rapidly in the mountain environment. Air assets need to be prepared for sudden weather deterioration. Thompson stepped forward to address his team. Remember, this mission succeeds or fails based on our ability to work seamlessly with our air support. Lieutenant Martinez has trained with us, understands our procedures, and knows how we think. Trust her guidance completely. Sarah felt the weight of that trust as she looked at the faces of Thompson's team. These were elite warriors who had operated in the world's most dangerous environments, and they were placing their lives in her hands. The responsibility was humbling and motivating simultaneously. The mission launched at 0200 hours under cover of darkness. Sarah's FA-18 climbed steadily through the night sky, its sophisticated systems painting a detailed picture of the terrain ahead. The mountain peaks appeared on her displays as forbidding obstacles that channeled her approach options into very specific corridors. Sky Knight 1, this is ground control. Thompson's voice came through her headset as his team began their insertion. We are boots on ground and beginning approach to Objective Alpha. Request reconnaissance sweep of the valley floor. Sarah banked her aircraft into the planned reconnaissance pattern, her sensors probing the darkness below for any signs of enemy activity. The thermal imaging revealed the expected civilian presence in the target compound, but also showed additional heat signatures that hadn't appeared in the intelligence briefings. Ground control. This is Sky Knight 1, Sarah transmitted. I'm seeing more personnel in the compound than anticipated. Count is approximately 20 individuals, with at least half appearing to be non-combatants based on movement patterns. Thompson's response revealed the value of their integrated training. Copy that, Sky Knight 1. Adjust surveillance pattern to focus on the eastern perimeter. We're seeing increased security measures that suggest our approach may have been detected. Sarah smoothly transitioned her aircraft into the requested pattern, using her altitude advantage to provide Thompson's team with real-time intelligence about enemy movements and positions. The reconnaissance capability she had discussed during their first simulation session was proving critical to mission success. As Thompson's team moved closer to the compound, the tactical situation became increasingly complex. Enemy forces began repositioning in response to some unknown trigger, creating new threats and opportunities that required constant adaptation of the original plan. Sky Knight 1, we need immediate assessment of the northern approach route, Thompson requested. Enemy movement suggests they may be repositioning to block our primary extraction path. Sarah directed her aircraft's sensors toward the northern valley, quickly identifying the tactical changes that Thompson suspected. Ground control. Confirm enemy repositioning along northern route. Count 6 personnel with heavy weapons establishing defensive positions. Recommend alternate extraction route through Eastern Valley. The mission continued to evolve as Thompson's team adapted their approach based on Sarah's aerial reconnaissance. The integration between air and ground elements was so seamless that they functioned as a single tactical unit rather than separate components trying to coordinate their actions. When Thompson's team finally reached the compound, Sarah provided overwatch that allowed them to approach undetected. Her thermal imaging identified guard positions and patrol routes, enabling the ground team to time their movements perfectly to avoid detection. Sky Knight 1, we are beginning compound infiltration, Thompson reported. Maintain overwatch and be prepared for immediate close air support if we are compromised. Sarah positioned her aircraft for rapid response while continuing to monitor the tactical situation. Her training with Thompson's team had taught her to think several steps ahead, anticipating potential complications and preparing solutions before they became critical. The rescue operation proceeded flawlessly until an unexpected development changed everything. Sarah's sensors detected additional vehicles approaching the compound from the south, carrying what appeared to be enemy reinforcements that could overwhelm Thompson's small team. Ground control. This is Sky Knight 1 with priority traffic, Sarah transmitted urgently. Enemy reinforcements approaching from the south. 3 vehicles with approximately 12 personnel. Estimated arrival at your position in 4 minutes. Thompson's response was immediate and decisive. Copy that, Sky Knight 1. We need those vehicles stopped before they reach the compound. Request immediate engagement. This was the moment that all their training had prepared them for. Sarah had to deliver precise airstrikes that would neutralize the approaching threat without compromising Thompson's team or endangering the civilians they were rescuing. Ground control. Understand request for immediate engagement of southern approach vehicles. Confirm all friendly personnel are clear of southern perimeter. All friendlies confirmed clear of engagement area, Thompson replied. You are cleared hot for engagement of vehicles on southern approach road. Sarah rolled her aircraft into the attack profile they had rehearsed dozens of times during training. The narrow valley limited her approach options, but the weeks of preparation had given her confidence in executing precision strikes under challenging conditions. The first missile struck the lead vehicle with devastating accuracy, immediately stopping the convoy's advance. Sarah's second pass eliminated the remaining vehicles before they could establish defensive positions or threaten Thompson's team. Outstanding work. Sky Knight 1. Thompson's voice carried obvious relief and admiration. Threat neutralized. Continue overwatch while we complete hostage extraction. The remainder of the mission proceeded according to plan, with Sarah providing continuous reconnaissance and security while Thompson's team successfully extracted all civilian hostages and gathered critical intelligence from the compound. As they flew toward the extraction point, Sarah reflected on how completely their months of preparation had paid off. The seamless coordination between air and ground elements had enabled mission success in a scenario that would have been extremely challenging using traditional operational approaches. Sky Knight 1. This is ground control, Thompson transmitted as his team reached the extraction zone. Mission complete. Hostages secured, intelligence gathered, and no friendly casualties. Outstanding support throughout the operation. Sarah felt a surge of professional satisfaction, unlike anything she had experienced in her aviation career. This mission had proven that their innovative approach to air-ground coordination could succeed under real combat conditions. The Pentagon briefing room was filled with senior military officials from every branch of the armed forces. Sarah stood at attention beside Thompson, both wearing their dress uniforms and displaying the medals they had received for the success of Operation Mountain Echo. The mission had exceeded all expectations and generated significant interest throughout the military hierarchy. General Patricia Hayes, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, addressed the assembled group with evident satisfaction. Operation Mountain Echo has demonstrated that integrated air-ground coordination can achieve results that traditional operational approaches simply cannot match. The hostage rescue was completed with 0 friendly casualties and perfect mission success. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and responsibility as she listened to the general's assessment. The mission's success had validated months of hard work and innovation, but it had also created expectations for future operations that would be challenging to meet consistently. Captain Thompson and Lieutenant Martinez, General Hayes continued, Your development of enhanced coordination protocols has attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. We want to discuss expanding this approach throughout the armed forces. Thompson stepped forward to address the group. General, the success of Operation Mountain Echo resulted from comprehensive training that gave both air and ground personnel deep understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. This wasn't just about better communication. It was about creating genuine partnership between traditionally separate military functions. Sarah added her perspective when invited to speak. The key breakthrough was realizing that air support could contribute much more than just firepower. By using aircraft for reconnaissance, communication relay, and tactical coordination, we created a force multiplication effect that enhanced every aspect of the ground operation. The questions from senior officers revealed both enthusiasm and skepticism about implementing their approaches more broadly. Some officials worried about the time and resources required for the intensive training that Sarah and Thompson had undergone. Others questioned whether their success could be replicated with different personnel and in different operational environments. Admiral Richardson from Naval Operations posed a particularly challenging question. Lieutenant Martinez, your training with SEAL teams was extremely intensive and time-consuming. How do we scale that approach to train hundreds of pilots across multiple squadrons? Sarah had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time developing her response. Admiral, we don't need every pilot to undergo full ground training, but every air squadron should have at least one pilot with extensive ground experience who can serve as a liaison and training coordinator. Similarly, ground units should have personnel with aviation training who can facilitate better communication with air assets. Thompson supported her proposal with tactical analysis. The force multiplication effect doesn't require everyone to be cross-trained. It requires key personnel who can bridge the gap between air and ground operations and facilitate effective coordination for entire units. The discussion continued for over 2 hours, covering implementation timelines, training requirements, resource allocation, and performance metrics. Sarah found herself contributing to strategic military planning at a level she had never imagined possible when she first answered Thompson's question about pilot psychology months earlier. Colonel Martinez from the Air Force raised concerns about pilot availability. Lieutenant Martinez, your proposal would require significant time commitment from our most experienced aviators. How do we balance this training requirement with operational demands? Sir, the time investment pays for itself through improved mission effectiveness, Sarah replied. Operation Mountain Echo achieved objectives that would have required larger forces and longer timelines using traditional approaches. The enhanced coordination actually makes operations more efficient. As the briefing concluded, General Hayes announced the creation of a new joint training program based on Sarah and Thompson's innovations. We're establishing the Joint Air-Ground Coordination Center, with Captain Thompson and Lieutenant Martinez as its founding directors. Your mission will be to develop standardized training protocols and oversee implementation across all military branches. The announcement was unexpected and significant. Sarah realized that her career trajectory had fundamentally changed. She would be leaving traditional squadron operations to focus entirely on developing and implementing joint operational procedures throughout the military. After the briefing, Thompson and Sarah met privately to discuss the implications of their new responsibilities. The Joint Air-Ground Coordination Center would be based at Nellis Air Force Base, with satellite training facilities at major military installations worldwide. This is bigger than either of us anticipated, Thompson observed. We're not just training individual units anymore. We're potentially changing how the entire military approaches joint operations. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. The success of Operation Mountain Echo has created expectations that we'll need to meet consistently. Every training program we develop, every protocol we implement, will be measured against that standard. Their conversation was interrupted by a secure phone call from General Hayes. Captain Thompson, Lieutenant Martinez, I have additional information about your new assignment. The Joint Air-Ground Coordination Center will be reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your work will influence operational doctrine at the highest levels of military planning. The call continued with details about resources, personnel assignments, and timeline expectations. Sarah learned that they would have access to advanced simulation facilities, dedicated training aircraft, and a staff of experienced instructors from all military branches. We'll start with a pilot program involving 3 squadrons and 3 ground units, General Hayes explained. If the results match the success of Operation Mountain Echo, we'll expand to full implementation across all branches within 2 years. After the call ended, Sarah and Thompson spent the evening planning their approach to the new assignment. They identified key challenges that would need to be addressed, including standardizing training across different military cultures, developing assessment criteria for joint operations, and creating sustainable training programs that could be maintained long-term. We need to remember what made our partnership successful, Thompson emphasized. It wasn't just the technical training. It was the mutual respect and genuine effort to understand each other's perspectives. Sarah agreed completely. Every pilot who goes through our program needs to understand that ground personnel aren't just requesting air support. They're trusting us with their lives. Every ground controller needs to understand that pilots aren't just following orders. We're making complex decisions about people we can't see. Their planning session continued late into the night, outlining curriculum development, instructor selection, and facility requirements. The scope of their new responsibility was enormous, but both felt energized by the opportunity to influence military operations on such a broad scale. As they concluded their planning, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. A simple answer to Thompson's question about pilot psychology had evolved into a career-defining opportunity to reshape joint military operations. "Captain," Sarah said as they prepared to leave, "6 months ago I was just another squadron pilot. Now we're responsible for training programs that could affect every joint operation in the military. It's almost overwhelming to think about." Thompson smiled the first time she had seen him truly relax since their initial meeting. "Lieutenant, 6 months ago I thought I understood everything about air support. Your insights showed me how much I didn't know. If we can create that same learning experience for others, we'll revolutionize how the military operates." The foundation for their new assignment was established, built on the proven success of their innovative approach and supported by the highest levels of military leadership. The real work of implementing their vision throughout the armed forces was about to begin. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the main training facility at Nellis Air Force Base, watching the latest group of pilots and ground personnel work through the integrated coordination exercises that had become standard throughout the military. The Joint Air-Ground Coordination Center had grown from an experimental program into a cornerstone of modern military training. The facility buzzed with activity as personnel from all branches of the armed forces participated in joint exercises that would have been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Advanced simulation systems allowed realistic training scenarios while sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked performance and identified areas for improvement. "Major Martinez," called Colonel Thompson, approaching with a tablet displaying the latest training statistics. His promotion had come through 6 months earlier, recognition of his role in revolutionizing joint military operations. The assessment results from this training cycle are exceptional. Cross-branch coordination scores are averaging 93%, compared to 67% before our program implementation. Sarah reviewed the data with satisfaction that was tempered by awareness of how much work remained. The numbers represented more than statistical improvement. They represented lives that would be saved and missions that would succeed because of enhanced coordination between air and ground forces. "The improvement is significant," Sarah agreed, "but I'm more interested in the qualitative feedback from actual operations. How are our trained personnel performing in real-world scenarios?" Thompson activated a different display, showing operational after-action reports from recent missions involving personnel who had completed their joint training program. The results were consistently positive, with mission commanders reporting smoother coordination, faster response times, and improved overall effectiveness. Operation Desert Shield last month is a perfect example, Thompson explained, highlighting a specific report. The ground commander specifically noted how his air liaison anticipated support needs and coordinated multiple aircraft types seamlessly. The mission was completed in half the time originally estimated. Sarah nodded, remembering her own early struggles to communicate effectively with ground forces. The training program they had developed addressed those communication gaps systematically, giving both pilots and ground personnel the vocabulary and understanding necessary for effective cooperation. A group of students approached, led by Captain Jennifer Walsh, a helicopter pilot who had just completed the Advanced Coordination course. Major Martinez, Colonel Thompson, we wanted to thank you for this training opportunity. The hands-on ground experience has completely changed how I think about close air support. Tell me specifically what you learned, Sarah requested, always interested in feedback that could improve the program. Captain Walsh considered her response carefully. Before this training, I thought my job was to follow directions from ground controllers. Now I understand that my job is to be a partner in the tactical decision-making process. When ground forces request support, I can contribute ideas and alternatives because I understand what they're trying to accomplish. Thompson smiled at the response, recognizing the same transformation he had observed in dozens of other students. That partnership mindset is exactly what we're trying to develop. When air and ground forces think of themselves as a single team rather than separate units, the tactical possibilities expand dramatically. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent message from the Pentagon. Sarah and Thompson were requested to brief senior leadership on expanding the Joint Training Program to include international coalition partners. The success of their approach had attracted attention from Allied military forces who wanted to implement similar coordination protocols. As they prepared for the trip to Washington, Sarah reflected on how much her role had evolved since that first briefing, where Thompson had asked about pilot psychology. She was now recognized as a leading expert in joint military operations, frequently consulted on strategic planning and operational doctrine development. The Pentagon briefing included representatives from 12 Allied nations, all interested in implementing enhanced air-ground coordination training for their own forces. Sarah presented the statistical evidence of improved performance while Thompson discussed the tactical advantages that effective coordination provided in complex operational environments. The key to success, Sarah told the international audience, is creating genuine understanding and respect between air and ground personnel. Technical procedures are important, but the human element is what makes coordination truly effective. Questions from the Allied representatives revealed the universal nature of coordination challenges that all military forces faced. Language barriers, different equipment systems, and varying operational doctrines created additional complications for international operations, but the fundamental principles of effective coordination remained consistent. General Larsson from the Swedish Air Force posed a particularly insightful question. Major Martinez, how do we adapt your training approach for smaller military forces that may not have the resources for extensive cross-training programs? Sarah had encountered this challenge before when working with smaller units within the U.S. military. General, the core principle is creating shared understanding between air and ground personnel. Even limited cross-training can be effective if it focuses on the most critical coordination points. We've developed abbreviated programs that can achieve significant improvements with reduced time, investment. The briefing concluded with authorization to develop international training protocols that could be adapted for different military structures and equipment systems. Sarah and Thompson would be working with Allied trainers to create standardized approaches that could improve coordination in coalition operations. On the flight back to Nevada, Sarah and Thompson discussed the broader implications of their work. The Joint Air-Ground Coordination Center had become a model for military innovation, demonstrating how questioning traditional approaches could lead to significant operational improvements. Sometimes I think about that first briefing, Thompson said, gazing out the aircraft window at the landscape below. When I asked about pilot psychology, I was just trying to understand how to work better with air support. I never imagined it would lead to all this. Sarah smiled, remembering her nervousness at answering his question in front of the assembled military personnel. When I stood up to answer your question, I was just trying to help ground forces understand the pilot's perspective. I had no idea that conversation would change both of our careers. Their discussion turned to future developments and challenges. Emerging technologies like unmanned aircraft, systems, and artificial intelligence were creating new opportunities for air-ground coordination while also presenting novel challenges that would require continued innovation and adaptation. The principles we've established will remain relevant, Sarah observed, but we'll need to keep evolving our approaches as technology changes. The human element will always be critical, but we'll need to integrate new capabilities as they become available. As their aircraft approached Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah could see the training facility that had become the center of joint military coordination development. The sight filled her with pride at what they had accomplished and determination to continue improving military effectiveness through enhanced cooperation. Thompson voiced what both of them were thinking. 2 years ago, we proved that our approach could work in a single operation. Now we've proven it can work throughout the military. The real test will be whether the next generation of military leaders continues to value this kind of integrated thinking. Sarah was confident about the future. The officers who had completed their training program were advancing in their careers, taking their understanding of joint operations to leadership positions throughout the military. The cultural change they had initiated was becoming institutionalized in ways that would ensure its continuation. As they landed and prepared to return to their daily responsibilities, Sarah realized that Thompson's original question about pilot psychology had sparked a transformation that extended far beyond anything either of them had initially envisioned. Their partnership had proven that innovation in military operations often began with simple questions and the willingness to challenge traditional assumptions. The training facility awaited their return, filled with the next generation of military personnel who would carry forward the lessons of enhanced coordination and mutual understanding that had become Sarah and Thompson's lasting contribution to military effectiveness.